Despite the fact that suburbia is something so ubiquitous on the physical landscape, I mean, it's the place where most of us live, there is no common agreed definition of what a suburb is. So it's been left to popular culture to shape our conception of suburbia in the popular imagination. There's a clear mismatch, though, of what the developers' dreams were of suburbia and what the intellectuals think of it as. So recently at the London Transport Museum, they had this exhibition of posters, and you could see the slogans, things like, leave all this drudgery behind. You will find true happiness in Hounslow, those kind of things. So suburbs were conceived in optimism. And there's lots of different types of suburbs, remember. So there's the Victorian villadom, there's those stereotypical 30s semis. Then there's also corporation suburbia, which were developed as homes fit for heroes, people returning from the Great War. I think what links all of these is they were conceived in optimism. But if you look at the popular cultural representations, a lot of them are really rather negative. I'd say that the adjective suburban in particular is a pejorative one. So if you think of George Orwell in his novel Coming Up for Air, the first person narrator George Bowling describes his street as a line of semi-detached torture chambers all in a row. Ouch. One of the defining features of suburbia was this idea of white flight. It's a sort of unspoken, that part of the reason why people left the inner cities was because of pollution and because of black people, to not put too fine a point on it. So this white flight idea was you get cleaner air, cheaper taxes, better standard of living, nicer class of neighbour in the suburbs. But I think that's no longer the case. So I think if you look at any suburban high street now, you'll see the impact of multiculturalism. Some places like, for example, New Malden in the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames, so that's in extreme South London, that's turned into a, quotes unquotes, South Korean suburb. So a lot of the shops there are South Korean restaurants and food stores. And I mean, there are some dire predictions that it was actually Boris Johnson who said this, that with housing benefit changes, there'd be Kosovo-style ethnic cleansing of the cities, sort of pushing more and more marginal people to the edges. But I think it's not as simple as that. There are sort of prosperous ethnic minorities as well in suburbs. I think there's all sorts of social practices and categories of people on the outer rim nowadays. And I think suburbs are much more complicated and dynamic than we give them credit for. There's this long-standing idea that in the suburbs, nothing ever happens. And I'd say there's two things that I mention in the book that give the lie to that. One is the riots in 2011, and the other is the rise of extremism in suburbia. They're two words you wouldn't normally put together. So the riots illustrate many things. I mean, a lot of the locations where rioting happened, Ealing and Croydon, were suburban places. Typically, you think of riots attacking centres of government or courthouses or town halls, those kind of things. It was actually in the hollowed out high streets that used to make suburbs such a draw that this sort of looting and ransacking happened. And I think extremism also is no stranger to the modern suburb. So there was a headline in the Daily Mail in 2005 that said suicide bombers from the suburbs. I think they traced the origins of some of these people that did the tube bombings, and they were from Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. We all saw recently the multicultural triumph of London 2012 and the Olympic Games. The next door borough to that is Barking and Dagenham in suburban East London. Just as recently as 2 years before the Olympics took place, the BNP, the far right, were the second biggest party on the council. So again, sort of extremism in many different forms is something that you see popping up in suburbs. You hear of it with the English Defence League wanting to do marches through places like Harrow. So I think we need to look at policy initiatives that focus on the suburbs. Again, some of these mythical constituencies that people think will help win them elections, things like Worcester Woman, Middle England, the squeezed middle, I think on the whole, it's suburbia stupid, all of them, that's what it equals. Because whether you're in a council house in suburbia or a big, huge Victorian detached pile that was once built for the carriage classes, I think some of the problems are the same. Decaying infrastructure, poor transport connections, those kind of things, they need addressing. because it's in the suburbs where the next election will be won or lost. And politicians and policymakers ignore that at their peril.